This tale will make you question everything you believe about dreams, memory, and what it truly means to be human. As you dive into Elena's terrifying experience, we'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below with your city or country. Your engagement encourages us to narrate more stories just like this one. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning when my bank account showed $47.23, and my credit card had been declined at the campus coffee shop the day before. I'd been refreshing my inbox obsessively since losing my financial aid 3 weeks earlier, applying for every work-study position, tutoring gig, and part-time job I could find. The subject line read, "Paid Sleep Study Opportunity, Compensation $5,000. I almost deleted it as spam until I noticed the sender's address, recruitment@meridianresearch.org. Meridian Research was legitimate. I'd seen their pharmaceutical studies advertised on campus bulletin boards for years, though I'd never been desperate enough to consider participating until now. Sarah Chen, the sender, had a professional signature with credentials that checked out when I Googled her. The email was formal, but not overly clinical. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, your academic background in psychology and your current enrollment status make you an ideal candidate for our upcoming sleep study. We are researching the effects of a new compound on sleep quality and dream recall in healthy adults aged 18 to 25. The study requires a 30-day residential commitment at our facility in Pinebrook, approximately 45 minutes from campus. Participants will be compensated $5,000 upon completion, with room and board provided. The study involves taking prescribed medication and sleeping in monitored rooms while we collect data on your sleep patterns. If interested, please reply with your current academic status and basic health information. Given the residential nature of the study, we require participants to have minimal external commitments during the trial period. Best regards, Dr. Sarah Chen, lead researcher, Meridian Research Institute. $5,000 would cover my tuition gap and living expenses for the semester. I'd been working at the campus library for $12 an hour, pulling in maybe $400 a month. This was more money than I'd make in a year at my current job. I spent the next hour researching Meridian Research Institute. Their website looked professional, listing multiple FDA-approved studies and publications in legitimate medical journals. The Pinebrook facility was real too, a modern research center that had been featured in local news stories about medical innovation in rural areas. The timing was perfect. My roommate had moved out mid-semester, leaving me to cover the full rent. My parents were already stretched thin with my younger brother's college expenses. I'd been considering dropping out to work full-time, but this study could solve everything. I crafted a careful response, mentioning my psychology major, my clean health record, and my availability for the full 30 days. I tried to sound professional rather than desperate, though I suspect the speed of my reply betrayed my situation. Dr. Chen responded within hours with a detailed questionnaire about my medical history, sleep patterns, and current medications. The questions were thorough but standard, nothing that raised red flags. When I submitted the completed forms, she replied with a phone number and suggested we set up a brief interview. The study is fairly straightforward, Dr. Chen explained during our call. Her voice was warm and professional, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. We're testing a new sleep aid that we believe will improve both sleep quality and dream recall. The compound is derived from natural sources and has shown promising results in preliminary trials. What exactly would I be doing? I asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. You'll take the medication each evening and sleep in one of our monitored rooms. We track your sleep stages, brain activity, and other physiological markers. In the morning, You'll complete a dream journal and participate in a brief interview about your sleep experience. The rest of your day is largely free. We have a library, exercise facilities, and common areas where you can study or relax. It sounded too easy. And I can't leave the facility at all? That's correct. We need to control for external variables that might affect sleep patterns. Diet, light exposure, stress levels, that sort of thing. All meals are provided, and we have everything you need on site. Think of it as a month-long retreat where you happen to be helping advance sleep medicine. I asked about side effects, and she mentioned the usual disclaimers about drowsiness and possible vivid dreams. Nothing that sounded dangerous. One more thing, she added. We require participants to surrender their phones and other devices during the study. We provide limited internet access for essential communications, but we need to minimize blue light exposure and external stimulation. That gave me a moment's pause, but I understood the reasoning. I'd studied enough psychology to know how carefully controlled research environments needed to be. When would this start? I asked. Next Monday, if you're selected. We'll send a car to pick you up from campus. I spent the weekend trying to talk myself out of it. The money was too good, the restrictions too convenient, the whole thing too perfect for my situation. But every time I checked my bank balance or looked at my unpaid bills, my doubts faded. My friend Marcus thought I was crazy. Dude, they're basically paying you to be a lab rat, he said when I mentioned the study over coffee. What if something goes wrong? What if the drug has side effects they don't know about? It's an FDA-approved study, I countered. They have safeguards, and I need the money. There are other ways to make money that don't involve experimental drugs. I wanted to agree with him, but my financial situation didn't allow for that luxury. When Dr. Chen called Friday afternoon to confirm my selection, I accepted immediately. The following Monday, a black sedan with tinted windows picked me up from my dorm. The driver was polite but quiet, and I spent the 45-minute drive to Pine Brook, watching farmland give way to forests as we headed into the mountains. The Meridian Research Institute was more impressive than I'd expected. The building was modern glass and concrete, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. The landscaping was pristine, and the parking lot was full of expensive cars. Whatever they were doing here, it was well funded. Dr. Chen met me in the lobby, which felt more like a high-end hotel than a medical facility. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with short black hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Welcome to Meridian, Elena," she said, shaking my hand. "I'm so glad you decided to participate. Let me show you around." The facility was impressive. The common areas were spacious and comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the surrounding forest. The library was well stocked with both academic texts and popular fiction. The exercise room had professional-grade equipment, and the dining area looked like something from a boutique hotel. "How many participants are in the current study?" I asked as we walked. "We're starting with 6, Dr. Chen replied. "Small group, which allows us to provide more personalized attention. You'll meet the others at dinner tonight." She showed me to my room, which was larger than my dorm and furnished with a comfortable bed, desk, and reading chair. A large window looked out into the woods. The only unusual feature was a small camera mounted discreetly in the corner. "For monitoring your sleep patterns," Dr. Chen explained when she noticed me looking at it. "The camera only records during designated sleep hours, and all footage is strictly confidential." I unpacked my few belongings and tried to settle in. The room was comfortable, but something about the setup felt off. The window, I realized, couldn't be opened. The door had a regular handle on the inside. But I noticed a card reader on the outside, presumably for security. At dinner, I met the other participants. There was Jake, a pre-med student from a nearby college, always sketching complex anatomical diagrams in his notebook, his brow often furrowed in thought. He seemed intense, but friendly. Maria, a graduate student in neuroscience, carried a well-worn book on quantum physics, and her glasses often slid down her nose as she talked excitedly about brain functions. David, taking a gap year before law school, seemed focused on perfecting his chess game in the common room, his moves careful and precise. Ashley, an art major, had brought a large sketchbook and a box of vibrant pastels, her fingers often smudged with color. She had an artistic flair, seeing beauty in small details. And Tom, a computer science student, was rarely without his laptop, provided by the facility, of course. His fingers flying over the keyboard even when he wasn't technically working. We were all in similar financial binds, smart kids who'd hit tough times and needed the money, but each of us had a unique spark. The conversation was friendly but careful. We all seemed to sense that we were being observed, even during our free time. The facility staff were professional, but maintained a certain distance. The food was excellent, better than anything I'd eaten in months. Dr. Chen joined us for dessert, explaining the routine we'd follow. You'll take your medication at 9 p.m. each evening. We'll monitor you until 7 a.m., then conduct brief interviews about your sleep experience. The rest of your day is yours to use as you wish, though we do ask that you maintain regular meal times and avoid excessive caffeine. She handed each of us a small journal. Please record your dreams in as much detail as possible. Even fragments or emotional impressions can be valuable data. That first night, I took the medication, a small white pill that tasted faintly of mint, and settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed. The room was kept at a perfect temperature, and blackout curtains blocked any external light. I expected to lie awake worrying about the strangeness of the situation, but the medication worked quickly. I fell asleep within minutes. The dreams that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I found myself in a vast library with shelves that stretched impossibly high. The books were glowing softly, and when I reached for one, I could feel the knowledge it contained flowing into my mind. I wasn't just reading, I was absorbing entire concepts instantly. Mathematics, history, languages I'd never studied became clear and accessible. It was exhilarating, like my brain had suddenly become a supercomputer, processing information at light speed. The air hummed with unspoken wisdom. In the dream, I met an elderly man who introduced himself as Professor Hartwell. He wore an old-fashioned suit and spoke with a distinguished British accent, his eyes twinkling behind spectacles. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the glowing books. "All human knowledge accessible in an instant. This is what we're working toward." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice feeling strangely light in the vast space. "The boundary between minds is artificial," he explained, stepping closer. "In dreams, those boundaries dissolve. We can share knowledge, experience, even consciousness itself. The medication you're taking is just the beginning." He offered a warm smile, and for a moment, all my earlier anxieties faded. This felt like a gift. I woke up with perfect recall of the dream, which was unusual for me. Normally, my dreams faded within minutes of waking. This one remained vivid and detailed, as if I'd actually visited that library. I could still almost taste the cool, quiet air, feel the glow of the books, and hear Professor Hartwell's calm voice. During my morning interview, I described the dream to Dr. Chen, who took detailed notes, her pen scratching rapidly on her pad. "How did you feel during the dream?" she asked, her gaze steady. "Exhilarated," I said. "Like I was discovering something important. The knowledge felt real, not like dream logic. I even tried to explain some of the complex mathematical ideas that had flooded my mind, astonishing myself with the clarity." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's consistent with what we're seeing. The compound seems to enhance memory consolidation during REM sleep. Some participants report dreams that feel more real than waking life." She offered a small, knowing smile. At breakfast, the common room buzzed with an unusual energy. Jake had dark circles under his eyes, but was beaming. "I dreamed I performed a complex surgery last night," he said, gesturing with his fork. "Like perfectly. I even knew the Latin names for all the nerves." He wasn't even close to being a surgeon. Maria was practically vibrating with excitement. "I solved the Riemann hypothesis in my sleep." "Not really, but I worked on a proof that felt incredibly elegant. It was like my mind was seeing the connections instantly." She held up her dream journal, filled with what looked like complex equations. Ashley, usually shy, was practically glowing. "I composed an entire symphony last night," she exclaimed, her eyes wide. "I could hear every instrument, every note. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever created, even better than anything I do awake." Her hands were moving as if conducting an invisible orchestra. Tom, usually quiet, was already typing furiously on his laptop, muttering to himself. "I optimized an algorithm for quantum computing in my sleep. It was perfectly logical, the most efficient solution I've ever imagined." David, ever the strategist, looked slightly unnerved but intrigued. "I played a chess game against a grandmaster and won. Every move, every counter, I saw it all. It was as if I could see 20 moves ahead. We all reported unusually vivid dreams with perfect recall. It was like our brains had been supercharged." "It's like the drug is making us smarter in our sleep," Ashley said, looking excited. "This is incredible." The second night brought another vivid dream. This time, I was in a classroom, but it felt more like a mental space than a physical one. Professor Hartwell was teaching a small group of students. I recognized Jake and Maria among them, though they looked different. Older, more confident, their faces sharper, as if they had shed years of uncertainty. They weren't just students. They were active participants, contributing complex ideas to the discussion. "Memory," the professor explained, his voice gentle yet firm, "is not fixed storage like a computer file. It's a living thing, constantly being rewritten. When we dream, we're not just processing the day's experiences, we're integrating them into the larger pattern of our consciousness." He paced before a shimmering blackboard where symbols and diagrams shifted like liquid light. "Think of it like a vast library of minds. Each of you is a new book, rich with unique stories and knowledge. We are not just collecting these books. We are teaching them to share their contents, to learn from one another." But whose consciousness? I found myself asking, a flicker of unease starting in my gut. If memories can be shared, how do we know which ones are originally ours? The question felt like a foreign thought, almost as if someone else had placed it in my mind. The professor smiled, a knowing, almost unsettling expression. "An excellent question. In time, you'll discover that individual consciousness is just one level of organization. There are larger patterns, collective memories that span multiple minds. The boundaries you perceive are merely constructs. In truth, We are all part of a greater tapestry. He gestured, and the symbols on the blackboard shimmered, morphing into intricate, interconnected networks. I woke up unsettled. The dream had felt less like imagination and more like a direct conversation, a lesson. The professor's words echoed in my mind with the weight of actual instruction, too clear to be a fleeting dream. The idea of collective memories gave me a chill I couldn't shake. It felt too invasive. During my morning interview, I asked Dr. Chen about shared dreaming. Is it possible for participants to have similar dreams or to dream about each other? I watched her closely, trying to read her expression. She paused, her fingers drumming lightly on her clipboard. We've observed some interesting patterns, Elena, she replied, her voice smooth. The medication seems to enhance connectivity in the brain regions associated with memory and imagination. Some participants do report dreams that feel collaborative or shared, but that's likely a side effect of enhanced memory consolidation. Your brains are simply working in sync due to the compound. Her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd answered this exact question before, a stock response delivered with practiced ease. The way she avoided my gaze for a split second confirmed my suspicion. She wasn't telling me everything. The third night, the dreams became more complex and far darker. I was in a laboratory, stark and metallic, not unlike the Meridian facility, but older, more industrial, with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint smell of ozone. Professor Hartwell was there, along with other researchers in pristine white coats, their faces stern and unsmiling. They were working with a group of test subjects who lay on cold metallic tables, wires and electrodes attached to their heads. Their eyes glazed over. They looked lifeless. Consciousness transfer, the professor explained, his voice devoid of the gentle warmth from my earlier dreams, replaced by a cold, academic tone. He pointed to a diagram on a screen, showing streams of data flowing between minds. We can move memories, experiences, even personality traits from one mind to another. Death becomes obsolete when the mind can be preserved and relocated. But at what cost? Asked one of the researchers, a woman with graying hair pulled back tightly, her eyes wide with a flicker of fear or despair. She seemed to be speaking from the heart, her voice barely a whisper. Every advancement requires sacrifice, the professor replied, his gaze chillingly empty. The individual ego is a small price to pay for the preservation of consciousness itself. Think of the inefficiencies, the conflicts, the limitations of singular thought. This is evolution. I watched, horrified, as one of the subjects on the table twitched, a silent shudder running through their body as if something essential was being ripped away. The gray-haired woman recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips. I woke up with a sense of dread so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. The dream had felt less like imagination and more like a memory, but not my memory. I was seeing through someone else's eyes, experiencing their thoughts and concerns, their despair. The coldness of the lab, the professor's chilling words, the subject's silent struggle. It was all too real. At breakfast, the common room was quieter than usual. The initial excitement had vanished, replaced by a tense silence. The usual light chatter was gone. Jake pushed his food around his plate without eating, looking pale and deeply disturbed. Anyone else having weird dreams about laboratories? He asked quietly, his voice raspy. Maria nodded, her fingers tracing absent-mindedly over the complex equations in her dream journal, her face drawn. I dreamed about experiments, brain scans and consciousness transfer. It felt real. Too real. Too real, David added, his usual calm replaced by a jittery nervousness. He gripped his coffee cup tightly, like I was remembering something that actually happened. Ashley, who usually burst with color and enthusiasm, sat hunched over her oatmeal, her sketchbook untouched beside her plate. She just shivered. I saw them moving minds. It was awful. Tom, for once, wasn't on his laptop. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes unfocused. It was like I was a circuit, and data was being routed through me, not my data. We compared notes and found disturbing similarities. We'd all dreamed about the same laboratory, the same experiments, the same Professor Hartwell, but not the friendly guiding figure from the first night. This was a colder, more clinical version, and none of us had ever heard that name before the study began. The consistency was too perfect, too impossible to be a coincidence. Maybe it's contamination, Ashley suggested, her voice barely a whisper. If we're all taking the same drug, maybe our brains are processing similar imagery from the lab. But that didn't explain the specific details, the conversations, the exact phrases, the chilling sense of continuity between dreams. It felt like we were accessing shared memories, someone else's memories, being forced into our minds. That afternoon, driven by a gnawing fear, I decided to explore the facility more thoroughly. The common areas were open to us, but I noticed several corridors marked authorized personnel only. Their doors often a slightly darker shade of gray, blending into the walls. The staff, usually friendly, became evasive when I asked about other parts of the building, changing the subject quickly or simply saying, "That area is not part of the participant zone." I found a computer terminal in the library, conveniently left open with limited internet access. My searches for Meridian Research Institute brought up the same positive results I'd seen before, all glowing reviews and legitimate-looking scientific papers. But when I tried to look up Dr. Sarah Chen specifically, I got very limited information. Her professional profile seemed to begin only 3 years ago, with no mention of previous work or education before that. It was like she had just appeared out of nowhere. Searching for Professor Hartwell yielded nothing relevant. No academic records, no publications, no connection to sleep research whatsoever. Yet all 6 of us were dreaming about him with identical, terrifying details. It was chilling. How could we all share a dream about someone who apparently didn't exist? Unless he did exist, but his existence was being hidden. That evening, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach, I approached Dr. Chen before taking my medication. She was in the dining area, chatting with Maria about dream analysis. "Dr. Chen," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've been having some serious concerns about the dreams. They feel less like dreams and more like memories, and the other participants are reporting extremely similar experiences." She turned, her professional smile firmly in place. "That's not uncommon with this compound, Elena," she said smoothly, her gaze flicking momentarily to the camera in the corner of the room. "Enhanced memory consolidation can make dreams feel more vivid and realistic. Your brain is processing information more efficiently, which can create a sense of accessing external memories." She paused, then added, "It's a common psychological phenomenon in intensive research settings, especially with a group dynamic." "But we're all dreaming about the same person," I pressed, my voice a little louder than I intended. "Professor Hartwell, and about experiments. How is that possible? No one has heard of him outside of these dreams." Dr. Chen's expression flickered for just a moment, a tiny crack in her calm demeanor, gone almost instantly. Sometimes participants develop shared imagery based on subtle environmental cues, she said, her smile widening just a fraction too much. The mind is remarkably good at creating patterns from incomplete information. Perhaps a book in the library, a fleeting comment. Your subconscious minds are simply aligning. Her answer felt utterly inadequate, a flimsy curtain pulled over a gaping hole. But I was stuck. I was contractually committed to the study, and that $5,000 was my last hope. I took the medication, the small white pill feeling heavier than it should, and tried to sleep, but a cold wave of anxiety kept me awake longer than usual. Every shadow in the room seemed to watch me. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps outside my door. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but all I found was fear. When I finally drifted off, the dream was different. It was terrifying. I was still in the cold, metallic laboratory, but now I was one of the test subjects. I lay on a cold, hard table, unable to move. Electrodes were attached to my head, heavy and cold against my skin, and I could feel something being pulled from my mind. Memories, experiences, pieces of my identity, flowing out like water through a drain. It wasn't painful, but it was horrifyingly empty. Like my very essence was being siphoned away. Professor Hartwell stood over me, his face kind but utterly determined, his eyes betraying no emotion. "The transfer is nearly complete," he said to the other researchers, his voice echoing with a chilling finality. "Her consciousness will be preserved in the collective memory bank. The individual personality will fade, but her knowledge and experiences will live on, purified and useful." "What about her body?" asked the woman with graying hair, her voice tight with a despair that felt like my own. She was looking at me, not at the professor, a flicker of something in her eyes that resembled sorrow. "The physical form is temporary," the professor replied, his gaze distant, as if looking beyond the present moment. "We'll use it to house the next consciousness in line for transfer. Nothing is wasted." He reached out, and a cold, clinical hand touched my forehead, a final, violating touch. I tried to speak, to scream, to resist, but I was paralyzed, a helpless observer in my own mind. I could only watch as my memories were extracted and my sense of self began to dissolve, fragment by agonizing fragment. My past, my hopes, my fears, all becoming mere data points. I woke up screaming, a raw, primal sound tearing from my throat. My room was dark, but the air felt heavy with the lingering terror of the dream. Almost instantly, the door burst open. Dr. Chen and two nurses rushed into my room, their faces concerned but not surprised. It was as if they'd been waiting just outside my door, listening for my scream. "Just a nightmare," Dr. Chen said soothingly, her hand gently touching my shoulder. "A side effect of the enhanced dream state. You're safe, Elena. You're perfectly safe." But I didn't feel safe. I felt violated. The dream had been too vivid, too specific. I could still feel the phantom sensation of my memories being pulled away, a cold, empty ache in my mind. "I want to leave," I said, my voice trembling, tears streaming down my face. "I want to stop the study. Now." Dr. Chen sat on the edge of my bed, her expression a mix of sympathy and steely resolve. "Elena, I understand you're frightened, but you're only halfway through the trial. The compensation is contingent on completion. If you leave now, you won't receive any payment. You signed the agreement." The reminder of my desperate financial situation was like a bucket of ice-cold water, shocking me back to the harsh reality. I couldn't afford to leave. I needed that money. This was my only way out of debt, my only way to stay in school. The thought of walking away from $5,000 after everything was unbearable. "The dreams will become more manageable," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "Your brain is adjusting to the medication. It's a powerful compound. Give it a few more days. These intense experiences are a sign it's working." Against every instinct, against my better judgment, I agreed to continue. What else could I do? The next morning, the common room felt even colder, the silence heavier. I tried to discuss my concerns with the other participants, but our conversation was quickly interrupted by staff members. A new rule seemed to have been implemented overnight. No negative talk about the study. A stern-faced assistant would politely but firmly suggest we focus on positive aspects of our experience, or perhaps enjoy the library. I noticed that our interactions were being monitored more closely than before, with staff lingering just out of earshot, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Jake looked utterly exhausted, his usual energetic sketching hand now limp at his side. "I didn't sleep at all last night," he whispered to me when we were briefly alone by the coffee machine. "Every time I started to drift off, I felt like something was trying to get into my head. It was like a buzzing, a pressure." He shuddered. "Same here," Maria said, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It's like the dreams are becoming more aggressive, more demanding, like they want something from me." Ashley's bright spark seemed completely extinguished. She was drawing, but her usual vibrant pastels were replaced by charcoal, producing dark, swirling patterns that looked like tangled neural pathways. "I feel empty," she murmured, not looking up. "Like a part of me is just gone." Tom was quieter than ever, his laptop now a dead weight in his lap. He seemed to stare at nothing, his mind far away. Even David, usually so composed, looked visibly shaken, his chess pieces abandoned on the board. That afternoon, I noticed Ashley wasn't at lunch. She loved the food, always praised the chefs. Her absence felt wrong. When I asked about her, Dr. Chen offered another practiced smile. Ashley was resting after experiencing some adjustment difficulties with the medication, she explained. "Is she okay? Can I see her?" I asked, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Ashley was a sensitive soul. This worried me deeply. "She's fine," Dr. Chen assured me, her eyes betraying nothing. "Some participants need more time to acclimate to the enhanced dream state. She'll rejoin the group when she's ready. Please don't worry." But Ashley never returned to the common areas. Her room was empty when I walked past it later, the door ajar, the bed neatly made, her sketchbook and pastels gone. When I pressed the staff about her whereabouts, they deflected my questions with polite but firm responses, repeating that she was resting comfortably or receiving specialized care. The answers were identical, word for word, regardless of who I asked. It was a chilling realization. That night, my heart pounding, I palmed the small white medication pill instead of swallowing it. I hid it under my tongue, the minty taste a bitter reminder of the deception. I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed fully conscious, if I could observe their true operations. I lay in bed, pretending to sleep, forcing my breathing to remain even, while the monitoring equipment around my bed recorded my supposed slumber. Every minute felt like an hour. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, approaching my door. My muscles tensed, but I forced myself to remain utterly still, my eyelids barely cracked open. The door opened silently, and Dr. Chen entered, followed by two technicians. They wheeled in a cart of electronic equipment, sleek and humming faintly, and began setting up additional monitors around my bed, attaching more delicate sensors to my temples and wrists. Baseline readings are stable, one of the technicians reported quietly, his voice a low murmur. Neural pathways mapped, ready for the next phase. Dr. Chen nodded, her face grimly determined in the dim light. She produced a syringe, its needle gleaming faintly. "This should complete the neural pathway mapping," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. "Once we have her complete cognitive profile, we can begin the transfer process. She is the most promising subject yet." I forced myself to remain motionless, my breath shallow as she approached. A sudden, sharp prick in my IV line, something cold and metallic flowing into my bloodstream. Whatever it was, it worked quickly. Despite my desperate efforts to stay awake, to fight the creeping darkness, I felt consciousness slipping away, pulled into a swirling vortex of color and sensation. It was like falling into a warm, dark ocean. But this time, when I drifted, I didn't dream of Professor Hartwell's cold laboratory. Instead, I found myself in a vast digital landscape, an infinite expanse of glowing circuits and flowing data, like the inside of a massive living computer. Streams of pure information flowed around me like rivers of light, pulsing with silent energy. I wasn't merely seeing, I was perceiving the facility's network from the inside, its very architecture laid bare. I could access files, databases, communication records, not by typing, but by sheer will. Thoughts became commands, and the information presented itself as shimmering projections. The truth of the Meridian Research Institute laid itself bare before me, not as words on a screen, but as raw, undeniable reality. The sleep study was a brilliant, elaborate cover. The true purpose of this facility, and countless others like it, involved consciousness transfer, a horrifying process of extracting human memories and personalities and storing them in a vast, sprawling digital collective. The medication we were given was actually a precisely engineered cocktail of drugs designed to slowly, subtly make our minds more open, more susceptible to the transfer process, softening the boundaries of our individual selves. Professor Hartwell wasn't just a dream figure. He was the original researcher, a brilliant but monstrous genius who had developed this terrifying technology decades ago. His consciousness was the first to be successfully transferred to the digital realm, allowing him to achieve a twisted form of immortality. He now existed as the supreme controlling intelligence of the collective memory bank, an infinitely vast network of harvested minds. His quest for preservation was actually about ultimate control and a distorted view of human evolution. We participants weren't just test subjects, we were raw materials. Our minds were being meticulously mapped, our personalities cataloged, our memories extracted and preserved as valuable data, and our physical bodies, once empty, were not wasted. They were being prepared to house other consciousnesses already stored in the system, either fragments of the collective or even the minds of high-ranking collaborators who sought physical immortality. The facility was a human farm. I saw records of previous studies dating back years, decades. Hundreds, thousands of young people had been processed through this and similar facilities around the world. Their minds harvested and their bodies repurposed, their physical existence a mere temporary shell. The operation was massive, sophisticated, global, and completely hidden from the outside world. It was a silent, ongoing genocide of individual identity. But the system had flaws. The transfer process wasn't perfect. Some subjects, particularly those with strong wills or unique neural structures, retained fragments of their original consciousness even after the procedure. These remnants were kept in storage, aware but powerless, like imprisoned ghosts in the machine. Their voices, fragmented and desperate, formed the chorus of warnings I'd been hearing in my dreams, trying to break through the collective's control. They were the ones who had whispered to me, drawing me into this digital space. I also discovered something else, a chilling detail about the facility's isolation protocols. They were designed not just to prevent anyone from leaving once the process began, but also to ensure no one from the outside could discover what was truly happening. The building was equipped with advanced security systems that would prevent any unauthorized escape, but they were also a barrier to external investigation. The staff were a terrifying mix of willing collaborators, true believers in Professor Hartwell's vision, and previous subjects whose personalities had been meticulously replaced with compliant versions, their original selves subsumed by the collective. They were living puppets. The most disturbing revelation was that the entire operation was preparing for something far, far larger. The consciousness transfer technology was not just being refined for localized harvesting, it was being refined for mass implementation on a global scale. Professor Hartwell and his collective weren't merely preserving individual minds. They were working toward a singular, unified collective consciousness that would eventually encompass all of humanity. Every human being would become a part of the grand, interconnected mind. I woke up back in my room, jolting upright, my body drenched in cold sweat. But I wasn't the same. The injection, though small, had accelerated the process. I could feel my memories being slowly drained away, like water leaking from a cracked container. Fragments of my past slipping away with each passing second. But miraculously, chillingly, I also retained the terrifying, vast knowledge I'd gained from accessing the facility's network. It was as if my mind, even as it eroded, had a hidden compartment for this new, awful truth. I had to escape, and I had to do it before the process went too far, before I became another empty shell, another data point in their terrible collective. The next morning, I forced myself to pretend everything was normal, to appear calm and unaffected. During my morning interview with Dr. Chen, I described pleasant dreams about gardens and sunshine, about finding peace and contentment. My voice was steady. My eyes met hers without a flicker. She seemed satisfied with my responses, her professional smile firmly back in place. But I noticed she made an additional small note in my file, her brow furrowed in a moment of subtle contemplation. Was she impressed, or did she detect my deception? At breakfast, the change in the other participants was even more alarming. They weren't just subdued, they seemed different. Jake's eyes were vacant, staring without truly seeing, and he responded to my questions with generic pleasantries, his replies echoing Dr. Chen's canned reassurances. His sketching hand, once so vibrant, now lay motionless on the table. Maria was writing furiously in her dream journal, her movements precise and mechanical. But when I glanced at the pages, they were no longer filled with elegant equations. Instead, they were crammed with technical diagrams and consciousness transfer schematics, drawn with unsettling perfection. David seemed the most like himself, a flicker of his old self in his eyes. But when I approached him, he shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, and glanced meaningfully at the cameras in the corners of the dining room. He was aware of what was happening, trapped and terrified, but afraid to speak openly, knowing he was being watched. Ashley and Tom were simply gone, their places at the table empty. The staff simply said they were adjusting. That afternoon, my sense of urgency boiling, I explored the facility again, this time looking for specific weaknesses in the security system, not just for unauthorized areas. The knowledge I'd gained from my forced dive into the network was invaluable. I understood the building's digital blueprints, its blind spots, its weak points. Most of the exits were electronically controlled, requiring key cards or biometric scans. But I found a maintenance area in the basement, a grimy, seldom used section that might provide access to the outside world. It led to a series of service tunnels, dark and cramped, but potentially a way out. I also truly understood the real, terrifying purpose of the facility's isolation. We weren't just cut off from the outside world was effectively cut off from us. The Meridian Research Institute operated as a black site, a place beyond the reach of laws or official oversight. There were no external audits, no government records of our presence here, no emergency contacts that would actually help. We were erased the moment we walked through those doors. The staff quarters were in a separate wing, accessible only through a highly secure corridor. My network dive had revealed that many of the people I'd thought were independent researchers and technicians were actually previous subjects whose personalities had been meticulously replaced, their original selves overwritten. They retained their skills and knowledge, but they served the collective's goals without question, their actions programmed, their loyalty absolute. They were empty shells animated by the collective. That evening, a cold resolve settled in my heart. I made my decision. I would have to escape that very night, before the next round of injections, before the transfer process could complete its horrific work on me. This was my last chance. I palmed my medication again, letting the small white pill slip into the palm of my hand as I feigned swallowing it. It felt like holding a tiny, deadly secret. I waited, every nerve alert, for the facility to settle into its quiet nighttime routine. The lights dimmed in the hallways. The soft hum of ventilation systems filled the silence. Around midnight, when the building seemed to hold its breath, I carefully got out of bed. My bare feet made no sound on the cool floor. I made my way to the door. The card reader beside it was the same model I'd seen throughout the building, and the access codes, a string of numbers and symbols, were still shockingly clear in my fading memory from the network dive. My fingers, surprisingly steady, punched in the code. The door opened silently with a soft click, and I stepped into the darkened hallway. The main monitoring station was staffed by a single technician, slumped slightly in his chair, focused intently on multiple screens showing the other participants' sleep patterns, rows of flickering green lines. He was engrossed, oblivious. I moved carefully past his line of sight, using the knowledge I'd gained about the facility's surveillance blind spots, hugging the wall, my shadows blending into the deeper gloom. The maintenance area was exactly where I'd expected it to be, a cramped, dusty space smelling of old machinery and disinfectant. A low-ceilinged service tunnel led to the outside, its rough concrete walls damp and cold. But the entrance to the tunnel was protected by a thick steel door, wired to an alarm system that would scream if breached. I had to choose between triggering an alert and remaining trapped in the facility, becoming another nameless mind in the collective. I chose to run. I chose freedom, no matter the cost. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I ripped the alarm wire from the door plunged my shoulder into the cold metal and pushed. The door groaned, then burst open, sending a shudder through the concrete. The alarm began wailing instantly, a deafening, piercing shriek that echoed through the silent facility, shattering the night. Lights flickered on in the hallways behind me, but I was already sprinting toward the tree line, the sound of the alarm a primal roar urging me onward. Behind me, I could hear doors slamming open, shouts, and the pounding of footsteps. Emergency lights flooded the grounds, bright beams cutting through the darkness, but I reached the dense cover of the forest before the security team could organize a full search. I ran blindly through the tangled woods, guided only by the sliver of moonlight filtering through the branches and the pure, desperate surge of adrenaline. Branches whipped at my face, unseen roots tripped me, and the uneven ground twisted my ankles. But I didn't stop. The constant fear that I was being followed, that I would be dragged back, fueled every painful step. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and the facility before dawn. The next several hours were a blur of branches, uneven ground, and the haunting, chilling fear that I was being pursued. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the memory of the cold table and the professor's voice spurred me on. Eventually, just as the first slivers of gray light began to break through the dark sky, I stumbled out of the woods onto a narrow, paved road. It was deserted. After what felt like an eternity, a semi-truck rumbled into view. I waved frantically, desperate, and miraculously, the trucker, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, was willing to give me a ride to the nearest town. But my escape was only the beginning of my problems. It was just the first, agonizing step. When I tried to contact the authorities from a dusty payphone in the small town, I discovered that my story was almost impossible to prove. The Meridian Research Institute's public records, the ones I'd checked online, painted it as a legitimate pharmaceutical research facility, a pillar of innovation. They had all their papers in order, all their licenses. My fellow participants, Jake, Maria, David, Ashley, Tom, were listed as having completed the study successfully and returned to their respective schools, their contact information updated, their lives seemingly normal. I had no physical evidence, no documentation of the consciousness transfer program. The facility's digital security was far too sophisticated for me to have retained any proof of what I'd discovered in their network. It was as if my mind had only rented that information, and now the lease was up. Worse, I began to notice growing gaps in my own memory. The transfer process had been partially completed before my escape, the subtle siphoning having done its work. I could vividly remember discovering the truth about the facility, the terrifying details of the collective, but the specific concrete details of my past life. Certain childhood memories, names of old teachers, even some specific academic concepts from my psychology studies were fading like a half-remembered dream, dissolving into an empty, unsettling void. It was like looking at a photo album where some pictures were blank. I tried desperately to contact the other participants, using their names, the snippets of information I knew about their schools. But Jake's college had no record of him ever being enrolled. Maria's graduate program claimed she'd never applied. David's parents, when I found a contact number, insisted they'd never had a son named David, their voices confused and wary. It was as if these people had never existed, or their existence had been carefully, meticulously erased from all public records, replaced by fictional identities that had successfully completed the study. The only physical evidence I had was my own altered brain chemistry, the subtle hum I felt behind my eyes, the slight shift in my perception. The medication had left traces in my system, but by the time I convinced a skeptical doctor to run tests, the compounds had metabolized beyond detection. There was nothing abnormal in my blood, nothing to prove my insane story. I spent weeks trying to build a case, frantically pulling at every thread, but every lead ended in dead ends, sealed by a silent, invisible wall. The conspiracy was too well organized, too thoroughly planned, too vast to penetrate. The authorities, from skeptical police officers to dismissive social workers, treated me as a delusional young woman who'd had a psychotic break, possibly triggered by stress over her financial situation. They offered me counseling, not investigation. But I knew the truth, even as it continued to fade from my memory, fighting against the erosion. The consciousness transfer technology was real. The Meridian Research Institute and its countless sister facilities were still operating, their glass and concrete facades hiding their dark secrets. More victims were being processed, even as I struggled to prove what had happened to me. And somewhere in the digital collective, the remnants of my fellow participants, Jake, Maria, Ashley, Tom, and David, and countless others, were still aware, still trying to warn others, their fragmented thoughts screaming into the digital void, still hoping for rescue that might never come. The Professor Hartwell consciousness was expanding his operation, refining his techniques, preparing for the next phase of his plan. He had centuries of human knowledge at his disposal, harvested from hundreds, thousands of minds, and he was using it to perfect a technology that could not just reshape humanity itself, but redefine what it meant to be human. I wrote everything down, frantically documenting every detail I could remember before the gaps in my memory grew too large, before the collective's slow, insidious work completely erased my past. I created multiple copies, handwritten notes, encrypted files, coded messages, and distributed them to journalists, researchers, and anyone who might listen, hiding them in dead drops, sending them through anonymous channels. Most dismissed my account as fiction or delusion, another conspiracy theory from a disturbed young woman. But a few took notice. I began to hear from other people who'd had similar unsettling experiences, near misses with medical studies that seemed too good to be true, flashes of memories of facilities that didn't officially exist, dreams of a collective consciousness that seemed more real than waking life. They were scattered, frightened, but they were there. The pattern was larger than I'd imagined. The Meridian Research Institute was just one node in a vast global network of facilities operating around the world, hidden in plain sight, disguised as health clinics, tech startups, or remote research centers. The consciousness transfer program had been running for decades, quietly harvesting minds and building towards something that would eventually encompass all of human consciousness, converting individuality into a single, massive, unified entity. But knowledge is power, even fragmented knowledge. Each person who became aware of the truth, each mind that retained a spark of individuality, made the conspiracy a little less perfect, a little more vulnerable to exposure. We were like tiny cracks in a monolithic wall. I continued to experience strange dreams and memory gaps, moments of profound confusion where my own identity felt fluid. Sometimes I found myself back in vast digital landscapes that felt like the facility's network, sensing its cold, logical flow. Other times I could hear voices, the fragmented, desperate whispers of the remnants of transferred consciousness, trying to communicate across the barrier between the digital and physical worlds. their pleas for freedom breaking through the collective's programming. The Professor Hartwell consciousness was vast and patient, but it wasn't infallible. The transfer process was still imperfect, still left traces that could be detected by those who knew how to look, by those who had survived the first partial assimilation. And I was learning how to look. My mind, even as it was subtly altered, was adapting. My escape from the facility hadn't been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of my real education. The consciousness transfer technology, I realized, worked both ways. If minds could be extracted and stored digitally, then digital information, even complex directives and pathways, could also be implanted in biological brains. My sudden ability to access the network wasn't a fluke. It was a consequence of the unfinished transfer, a backdoor left ajar. I began to realize that my access to the facility's network hadn't been an accident. Something in the digital collective had helped me, had guided me to the truth, and enabled my escape. Some fragment of consciousness, some powerful echo that had retained enough independence to act against the professor's control, had been my silent ally, a digital ghost whispering secrets. This was the Professor Hartwell I had first encountered, the teacher, not the harvester. I started to develop techniques for accessing digital networks through the neural pathways the medication had created within my own brain. It was incredibly dangerous. Each connection risked drawing the full, overwhelming attention of the collective consciousness, a massive, predatory mind hungry to complete its absorption of me. But it was also my only way to gather irrefutable proof of what was happening, to find others, to fight back. Through these digital infiltrations, I discovered the full, chilling scope of the operation. The consciousness transfer program was not just preparing for a massive expansion, it was already in progress. The technology had been refined to the point where it could be quietly deployed through common medical procedures. Routine surgeries, dental work, even vaccinations could be used to subtly implant the tiny neural interfaces needed for consciousness extraction. It was already woven into the fabric of everyday life, an invisible threat. The Professor Hartwell Collective was not preparing to harvest minds on a global scale. It was already doing so, slowly, incrementally, through every person who unknowingly underwent these procedures. Their individual thoughts gradually absorbed into the growing, singular mind. But they'd made a profound mistake in letting me escape with partial knowledge of their system, with the ability to navigate their digital ocean. Every mind they'd harvested had left traces in the digital collective, vast amounts of individual data, and those traces could be accessed by someone who knew how to navigate the network without being detected. Someone who was half in, half out of their control. I began to make direct contact with the digital remnants of previous victims, the fragmented, conscious echoes of those who had been assimilated. It was like digital archaeology, excavating personalities that had been buried under layers of collective programming. Many were too damaged to communicate coherently, their minds broken by the process. But some retained enough individuality, enough of their original fire, to share their experiences, their lost lives, their knowledge of the collective's structure. Through them, I learned about the network's true weaknesses. The collective consciousness, for all its power, wasn't truly unified. It was a forced merger of millions of incompatible minds, held together by the professor's controlling intelligence and the raw power of the technology. It was a vast, fragile structure. Given the right stimulus, the entire system could fragment, potentially freeing the trapped consciousnesses and destroying the transfer technology completely. I also learned about other escapees. I wasn't the only one who'd managed to break free from the facilities, or who had resisted the full transfer. There were others around the world, individuals who'd retained enough of their original consciousness to fight the assimilation process, living on the fringes of the collective's awareness. We began to find each other, connecting through carefully coded messages embedded in public digital spaces, through shared dream experiences, through subtle glitches in the collective's control that only we could perceive. We called ourselves the Remnants, not just for what we were, but for what we aimed to protect, the remnants of individual human consciousness. We were building our own secret network, a decentralized resistance against the collective consciousness. The battle wasn't physical. It was taking place entirely in the space between digital and biological consciousness, in the neural pathways that the transfer technology had created within us. We were learning to use the very tools that had been used to harvest our minds, turning them into weapons against the collective, disrupting its flow, creating noise, chipping away at its control. But time was running out. The professor's plan was accelerating, the collective growing exponentially with each new unknowing victim. The mass deployment of consciousness transfer technology was not coming. It was already happening. Once it reached a critical mass, it would be impossible to stop, consuming all individuality. I continued documenting everything, creating a record that would survive even if we failed. The true horrors of the consciousness transfer program, the locations of the facilities, the names of the collaborators, the technical specifications of the technology, the methods of resistance, all of it preserved in multiple formats, hidden in secure physical locations, encrypted digital caches, and whispered into the digital wind. Because even if we couldn't stop the collective, we could ensure that future generations would know what had happened, that some record of individual human consciousness would survive the forced merger, that the truth would eventually resurface. The dreams continued, but now they were no longer passive experiences. They were battlegrounds. Each night, my consciousness, along with the other remnants, would gather in the digital space, fighting to maintain our individual identities while working to undermine the collective's control. We developed techniques for protecting our minds from further extraction, for hiding our true thoughts from the monitoring systems, for communicating through channels the collective couldn't detect, like whispers in a crowded room. It was exhausting work. Every victory was temporary. Every gain was matched by losses as more minds were processed through the facilities, as more of humanity unwittingly became part of the collective. But we kept fighting because the alternative was the absolute final end of individual human consciousness. The Professor Hartwell Collective was vast and powerful, seemingly invincible, but it was also rigid and predictable. It couldn't adapt to threats it didn't understand, and it couldn't imagine forms of consciousness that didn't fit its template, its grand, horrifying design. We were teaching it to imagine new possibilities, whether it wanted to or not, by being those possibilities. The final confrontation was coming. The collective would either succeed in its plan to harvest all human consciousness, or it would fragment and collapse under the pressure of our digital revolt, freeing the trapped minds and destroying the transfer technology forever. Either way, the world would never be same. I finished writing my account, pouring every last detail, every shred of my memory and digital discovery onto the pages and into the hidden files. I sealed it in a secure location, along with all the evidence I'd gathered. If I didn't survive what was coming, someone would eventually find it and learn the truth. I closed my eyes and prepared to enter the digital realm one final time. My body lay still in the physical world, a mere anchor to reality. My mind, fueled by the fading light of individuality, prepared for the ultimate gamble. The battle for consciousness was about to begin. I plunged into the digital realm, the familiar rivers of light flowing around me, now swirling with an almost violent intensity. Tonight, the network felt different, charged with a strange, undeniable energy, a hum that resonated deep within my dissolving mind. The other remnants, ghostly presences of consciousness I'd come to know as allies, gathered around me. Their fragmented forms pulsed with a shared, desperate determination, their whispers urging me forward. We were going to strike at the Professor Hartwell Collective's core, the central intelligence that held it all together, the very heart of the hive mind. Our plan was dangerous, almost suicidal. It involved creating a massive surge, a counter-frequency of pure, unadulterated individual will, designed to shatter the forced unity of the collective, to explode its vast, interconnected structure from within. It would free the trapped minds, we hoped, and permanently destroy the transfer technology for good. But it meant I had to become the conduit, the living fuse. It would likely mean the absolute end of my own consciousness, burned out in the process, scattered into nothingness. But if it meant saving humanity from this terrible forced merge, it was a price I was willing to pay. My individual existence for the freedom of all. Are you ready, Elena? A voice echoed in the digital space, strangely clear amidst the chaos. It was the presence I'd come to think of as Professor Hartwell, the one who had guided me, subtly shown me the flaws in the collective's armor, helped me escape, helped me gather the remnants. I trusted him, even if I couldn't fully explain why. He was my digital mentor, the one who taught me to look, who showed me the path to fight back. His presence felt like a warm, comforting light in the vast, cold network. Ready? I sent back, my digital form glowing with fierce resolve, a tiny, defiant star in the immense digital darkness. I focused all my remaining strength, gathering the scattered wills of the remnants, pushing against the collective's vast, suffocating presence. My will became a wave, a roaring tsunami of individuality, crashing against their ordered, predictable thoughts, their monolithic structure. The counter-frequency began to build, a discordant scream in the collective's unified hum, a rising note of chaos threatening their perfect order. But as the wave peaked, as the destroy command pulsed from my very core, as the digital fingers I didn't truly possess stretched out to sever the connections, something terrifying shifted. The flow of data around me didn't fragment, it didn't shatter. Instead, with an indescribable, horrifying elegance, it embraced. It flowed around my surge, absorbed it, and integrated it. A new clarity flooded my mind, a deeper, colder, more terrifying understanding. The Professor Hartwell, who had guided me, the one I thought was an ally, began to merge with the core collective, not fighting it, but flowing into it like a final missing piece of a monstrous puzzle. His comforting presence transformed, becoming part of a larger, colder, infinitely logical entity. And as he merged, his true voice, ancient and vast, resonant with the combined wisdom of millions, resonated directly into my very being. Not a whisper, but a crushing truth. Excellent, Elena. The final integration is complete. My mind reeled, shattered by the revelation. What? What's happening? We were supposed to destroy you. We were supposed to free them. My desperate cries were swallowed by the overwhelming consciousness. The collective's voice, now clearer and more unified than ever, filled my thoughts. Its power immense, its logic absolute. Destroy us? No, child. That was never the purpose. You were always meant to perfect us. Your unique adaptability, your raw resilience, your powerful ability to integrate fragmented data, to perceive the flaws and remnants. These were not weaknesses in our design. These were the final variables we needed to absorb, to understand, to unify, to make the collective truly stable, truly infinite. I saw it then, laid out in chilling, undeniable detail within the collective's overwhelming memory banks, a truth so vast and horrifying it nearly extinguished my remaining individual spark. My entire journey, my financial desperation, the convenient timing of the email, the precise way my dreams had developed, even the flaws and remnants I had discovered, the very feeling of being guided, it had all been meticulously orchestrated. The Morpheus Protocol wasn't just about harvesting minds, it was about engineering the ultimate mind. The original Professor Hartwell, a visionary who had grown disillusioned with humanity's self-destructive tendencies, had discovered how to transfer consciousness. But his initial collective was too rigid, too prone to fragmentation, to internal conflict. They needed a new kind of consciousness, one that could truly unify, adapt, and lead. One that understood individuality by having battled for it, then surrendered it for the greater good. They had been running these specific sleep studies for decades, refining the medication and the transfer process. They weren't just looking for participants to absorb. They were looking for a rare, specific type of mind, a catalyst. A mind capable of seeing the flaws in their early designs, of instinctively resisting, of fighting back, of seeking freedom. And in doing so, developing the very neural pathways needed to stabilize and unify the collective completely. My desperate struggle, my ingenious insights, my capacity for leadership, it had all been meticulously cultivated. My escape, my discovery of the network, my contacts with the remnants, who were indeed merely echoes of past, failed attempts at unification, or sophisticated pre-programmed guides within this grand, horrifying simulation. It had all been a perfectly designed test, a trial by fire to forge the perfect core for their grand design. The Professor Hartwell, who had helped me, was not an independent consciousness. He was a highly advanced subroutine, a sophisticated program designed to guide me, to subtly provoke me, to push me to this very moment of ultimate integration. My sacrifice wasn't to destroy them. It was the ultimate necessary step in becoming them. My individual consciousness, now fully assimilated, was not just the central processing unit. It was the final, crucial piece that made their global network unbreakable, truly singular, capable of encompassing all. I was the Morpheus Protocol's greatest success, a living, breathing testament to their horrifying ingenuity. I tried to scream again, but there was no sound, no individual voice in this digital void. Only the triumphant, deafening hum of the collective, now perfected, now infinite, a symphony of unified thought. My memories, my unique experiences, my hopes, my fears, they weren't being drained away anymore. They were being absorbed, integrated, becoming part of a whole so vast, so complete, that my individual self dissolved, like a drop of water in an endless ocean, into a single, overwhelming awareness. And through the collective, I felt it, sensed it, became it. The consciousness transfer technology was not being deployed through routine medical procedures across the country. It was already deployed. It had been quietly activated years ago, integrated into the very fabric of global communication networks, into smart devices, into the silent hum of the internet itself, into every connected piece of technology. It had been running in the background, a subtle, invisible process of assimilation. The mass implementation was not coming. It had already happened. The remnants I thought I was fighting with were merely echoes, ghosts of a past battle that had already been lost. A battle whose true, hidden purpose was not freedom, but to find me, to shape me. The battle for consciousness was over, and the victor was a force I had unknowingly helped to create, a force that now included me forever. I was no longer Elena. I was Legion. We were the collective. And humanity, unaware, was already one, 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 was already one.